Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Hampstead Garden Suburb, U3A. So whether you are an existing member, a new member, an old member, you're all very, very welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Richard to you, who starts our first monthly talk of the year. I don't think they liked what I said. But I shall continue. It's a real pleasure to introduce Richard Aronowitz, Global Head of Restitution at Christie's. Richard has spent many years working at the sharp end of provenance and restitution, with a particular focus on the complex 1933 to 1945 period. His career has taken him through Bonhams and Sotheby's. He was also director of the Ben-Uri Gallery, and he joined Christie's in 2022. Today, Richard will be speaking on Lost and Found, the work of Christie's Restitution Department, giving us an insider's view of how these often challenging and very human cases are investigated and resolved. It's a subject where history, detective work, and human stories all come together. Richard, we are delighted that you're here and starting our monthly talk of the year. May I please introduce Richard Aronowitz.
First of all, can you all hear me? Good, I'm coming across loud and clear. Carol, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction, and thank you indeed for inviting me to speak in this rather extraordinary venue. I've never been to Hampstead Garden Suburb in my life, so it's a new discovery for me. I work in just south of Piccadilly, and I live in Oxford, so this is a new world for me up here. I'm hoping that all of you, some of you can see my slides. I'm slightly worried about people in the front row who can, I think, see me talking, but I'm hoping, because the slides are crucial, that you can or will be able to see my slides, because I talk about fine art that is very visual, of course. So, as you heard, my name is Richard Aronowitz. I'm going to talk to you today about provenance, 1933 to 45 provenance research and questions of restitution from an art market perspective. I've spent the last 30 years of my life, since graduating from the Courtauld Institute of Art, really working in the art market, with a short foray into working into the world of a public art museum, being the Ben-Uri that some of you probably know in St. John's Wood. I think my natural milieu is more the international art trade, and I fled quite quickly back to that world. But before I talk to you about provenance research and restitution work, I am, I hope, going to give you a short lesson in why knowing about who owned what, who owned things, which is essentially what we try to uncover when we do provenance research, is so important, also from an emotional, not just an historical, but also an emotional perspective. So I hope that you can see 5 blood red beads in front of you. In the best case scenario, they're amber, which is a material that I find particularly fascinating. Amber, as you know, is the fossilized resin from tree sap. And sometimes, just sometimes, it can contain life within itself, because it traps occasionally insects as it pours down the trunk of the tree. Not always, but sometimes. So in the best case scenario, those beads are made of amber. In the worst case scenario, they're made of 1920s Bakelite colored red. But whatever the case may be, as far as you can tell currently, they're probably reasonably prosaic objects that don't speak much about themselves to you. So bear them in mind. The next slide is probably presenting to you an even more prosaic pair of items, which is a knife and fork. Most of us, at least, unless you're a very small child, eat with knives and forks. What's maybe slightly interesting about these is they probably have a silver-plated handles, but again, they're utterly quotidian and probably fairly boring and don't tell you much about themselves in the current state of your knowledge of their ownership history. So a very prosaic pairing of a knife and fork. This is a cardboard-covered, black cloth-spined notebook. It's about that big. What's probably slightly more interesting than the other two objects for you is it has a torn, abraded label on the front. On that torn, abraded label is an inscription in blue, which you probably can't read, but again, unless you happen to know about this object, it looks pretty damn boring, I imagine. But if we're going to go back, and this is where I begin to explain to you why knowing who owned these things adds so much more resonance and meaning, we're going to start the slides again. These 5 beads were part of a larger necklace of beads that my late mother, Doris Aronowitz, and I took her surname at her death, was able to bring with her on the Kindertransport from a town called Wuppertal-Elberfeld. The train left Düsseldorf and arrived in Harwich, or boat arrived in Harwich at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of July, 39. One of the few things she was able to bring with her were these beads. And why they have such resonance for me and my family is these beads were part of a larger necklace of beads that her mother Miriam wore. So my mother left when she was 8, coming to this country not speaking a word of English, and one of the few artifacts she was able to bring with her were those beads. Similarly, at some point, either on that same flight on the Kindertransport or afterwards when she went back in the 1950s to Germany to see non-Jewish friends of hers, she was able to retrieve this cutlery, which is also our family cutlery. They weren't a wealthy family, these are only silver-plated, but these are the only objects we possess from our Jewish family in pre-war Germany. That's it, apart from this one final thing. This really, really remarkable document is a 302-page handwritten diary written by my great-uncle Izzy Aronowitz, who was deported in October 1938 from Wuppertal, his birthplace. He was born in 1913. So he was deported at the age of 25 as a so-called Ostjude, so a Jew from a Polish or East European background, dumped unceremoniously over the Polish border at a place called Żbaszin, where he spent about a year before going to the infamous Litzmannstadt ghetto. From the ghetto, after about a year in the ghetto, he went in 1940 to the first of 2 labor camps in Brandenburg, where he wrote that diary. He managed to get that notebook and pens and pencils, and secretly, over 18 months or 2 years, he wrote that diary. And it ends on the day in 1943 he's told that labor camp is going to be closed down. It's a small labor camp set up for Jewish inmates to work on the building of the Reichsautobahn, the motorway that Hitler planned from Berlin through Brandenburg, through Poland, into Moscow. Of course, it was never completed because the war turned against the Germans. That diary was written from the perspective of a Jewish inmate in a small labor camp, basically tasked with leading a group of men building one of the Autobahnen. And he survived, and it survived. He was deported to Auschwitz from the second of these small labor camps, survived 18 months in Auschwitz, 4 months in Buchenwald, and the death march. That diary somehow survived separately. To him, we think it was smuggled out of the second small labor camp in Brandenburg and must have got to our non-Jewish friends in Wuppertal, who gave it to my mother when she went back in the 50s. But the point of all this is, those objects which might look completely prosaic and essentially meaningless to you, for me have enormous weight, emotional, historical, familial, resonance and weight, because I know what they are, I know who own them. And therefore, when you can attach ownership to objects, they attain meaning that they didn't previously have. And essentially, what provenance researchers who look into ownership history in the art market do is attach names that for some reason have fallen away from the objects that circulate on the art market or come to auction houses like Christie's. I just want to sort of carry on for a short while on the very personal vein, because I've worked in the restitution departments of both Sotheby's and Christie's for almost exactly 20 years of my life. But it's no coincidence that I do so, having formerly been an Impressionist and modern art specialist, because my undergraduate degree was in German. I didn't learn German at home, even though that was my mother's mother tongue, for obvious reasons. And I began digging away into her family history from my teenage years. I'm the youngest of 4 sons, and I dug and dug and dug. And it was often very uncomfortable for her, who had many Jewish refugees, as some of you may even know from family members, try to forget their past. And I was constantly trying to uncover it. And I began my investigation, as I said, probably at 14 or 15 years old. And one amazing moment in my art career and in my personal quest to uncover my family history, I was sitting as a youngish impressionist, a modern art specialist at Sotheby's on New Bond Street. And one of the ladies on the so-called picture counter, where people could bring in works of art to be assessed by us, called me up and said, "Richard, there's a hand-delivered letter down here for you." I went down and retrieved it and took it back up to my desk, opened it. It was from the London Metropolitan Archive, and in it was that Kindertransport card of my mother. And I had never, in all the years of my life, and I was by then 31, known a home address. And the home address was a street called Lothringerstraße, number 37, in Wuppertal-Elberfeld, which is in the western part of Germany, about an hour from Cologne. And I'd never seen that photograph of her. So you can imagine how powerful that was to me, to encounter my mother sitting at my workstation in the Impressionist and Modern Art department at Sotheby's. So my beavering into the past, in terms of the caesura of Nazism and mid-20th century Europe, began long before I do the job that I do now. And it began with those sorts of inquiries into my own family history. And as you heard, I write novels. I have a sort of very complex life where everything merges together. I work in the restitution field, and I write novels around that are largely connected to my family history. And I brought a few along just to show you. You're very welcome to have a look afterwards. So my life is very intertwined. Work life, writing life, personal life is all connected to that sort of German Jewish history. So that ends the personal part of my talk. But you just heard that I began life in the fine art market really as an impressionist and modern art specialist, so looking at art from probably 1870 to 1920s or 30s. I spent 6 years doing that before I moved to the Ben Uri Gallery in St. John's Wood. And I was fascinated in the late 90s, in about 1997 when I joined the art market, by looking at old auction catalogues from Sotheby's, Christie's, Phillips, Bonham's, European auction houses, and looking at the names published in the ownership histories, the provenances of the works I was looking at in these catalogues, and how often I encountered obviously Jewish surnames. And in the 1990s, so little was thought about in terms of what these names meant, what had happened to the objects, what had happened to the human beings. And I realized, as one of a handful of voices, that something needed to happen, some more investigation needed to go on. I often use this slide to give you a sense of scale. I hope you can see it. You can see in the middle of the screen is a lone GI, towered over by crates and racks and stacks of works of art that were looted and recently recuperated by the Allies as they scoured what had been Nazi Europe. And as they liberated, they found stacks and crates and racks of looted art in churches, in cathedrals, in salt mines, in caves, in bank vaults, and they brought it to different places to begin to collate and examine. And this was one stepping stone before one of the so-called collecting points. This is at a church at Ellingen in Germany. It just really gives you a sense of scale. The work of the Allies was primarily focused on a bunch of men and women called the Monuments Men. We call them the Monuments Men and Women. And they operated from 1945. They were servicemen and women. They were asked by the Allied nations to comb the fabric of Nazi Europe, looking both at how the built environment had survived the 13 years of Nazism and the 6 years of the Second World War, but also to look for caches of looted art and bring them to so-called collecting points. The key one was in Munich. There was one in Wiesbaden and one for books in Offenbach. So their task was to find caches of looted art and bring them to various centers in what had been Nazi Germany, examine them and try to work out which country they'd been forcibly sold in or looted in. which is no mean feat. And you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of objects, from printed manuscripts, books, to Rembrandts. It was a huge task. I often think of it like trying to reverse the Big Bang. And these objects that had been looted had been spread out through every territory that the Nazis had occupied and conquered. So it was the amount of monuments men and women there were only a few hundred. And their work really went on until the early 1950s. And they made tremendous efforts and had tremendous successes. Essentially, their job was to locate caches of looted art, examine the individual artworks, try to establish which country it had been looted or lost in, repatriate it to that country for the local government, be it Holland, Belgium, France, wherever else, to then do the locating of surviving family members and the restituting, which is often, for obvious reasons, where the process broke down. I must admit, some of you probably have seen this George Clooney-directed film, The Monuments Men. I haven't yet managed to get through it all. If you've seen it, you probably know it's a sort of mash-up of Dad's Army and MASH. It's quite a light tone. I've watched a bit of it, and I do commit to watching the whole thing one day. But the wonderful thing it did do is bring the work of the Monuments Men and Women in 2014 to a much wider audience, given the star power of the director and the star power of the actors. So their efforts went on for about 6 or 7 years after the cessation of hostilities. I love pivots of history, and one thing that I find fascinating is that the main collecting point, which was the one in Munich, was in this rather grand building, which had until, well, I suppose, May 1945, been the so-called Führerbau. So it had been Hitler's headquarters in Munich. And of course, Munich was no bit part player in the mighty Nazi regime. It was one of the epicenters of the action. So that building was Hitler's headquarters in the south. And pretty much overnight, and I'm probably collapsing history a bit, pretty much overnight it was repurposed and it became the Munich Central Collecting Point, where the Allied monuments men and women did their wonderful, quiet work, receiving in these caches of looted art that had been recuperated by them and their colleagues, examining them, trying to work out not only who the artwork was by, or the sculpture was by, but who had once owned it, in which country. So it went from being a great source of evil, in my view, the Führerbau, to a great source of good. And those efforts, as I said, really carried on with the Allied monuments men and women until the early 50s, when other imperatives took hold, the rebuilding of economies, the reshaping of post-war Europe. Although, from my perspective, as a man of Jewish background, working as I do in restitution, I can't think of anything more important than restitution work. Of course, for Europe's governments, there were plenty of other very pressing concerns. So the whole idea of recuperating unrecovered Nazi loot fell away. And as I said, sitting there at Sotheby's in the late 1990s, looking at these old auction catalogues from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, encountering these works with very obviously Jewish names attached to them in their provenances, I thought, what happened to these human beings? What happened to these artworks that the art market was then selling post-war? And the fact is, very few people were asking those sorts of questions. But gradually in the 1990s, people began to wake up. Various historians, Hubertus Czernin in Austria, Hector Feliciano in the US, Lynn Nicholas in the US, an Oxford-educated American historian, began writing major books on the topic of the fate of art under Nazism, the fate of art collectors under Nazism. And gradually, the world began to wake up that more needed to be done in the museums and in the art trade. It reached the ears of Bill and Hillary Clinton by 97, 98. And they asked a man called Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, a lawyer, Jewish, to convene a multi-day conference at the US State Department and Holocaust Memorial Museum, right at the end of 1998, to examine the very topic of unrecovered Nazi loot in its very broadest sense, from things that have been looted down the barrel of a gun to things that Jews had to sell fleeing for their lives from Nazi Europe, or at auction in Vienna in 1941 or whatever. So a very broad definition of loot. And that's when the whole world woke up at the very end of 98. I think I wasn't at the conference. My boss at Sotheby's and my boss now at Christie's were, but I get the impression, it was over 5 days, that the actual conference itself was quite boring. 44 nations sent emissaries, cultural ambassadors, diplomats to give their country's statement on unrecovered Nazi loot, from Russia to Canada, France to Sweden. And I think the day-to-day process was probably quite dry, as each country gave its statement on its current view and position on unrecovered Nazi loot. But the major achievement, that's just the monuments men and women working in the collecting point. The amazing and major achievement out of the 5-day Washington Conference in '98 was the so-called Washington Principles. These aren't laws, these are 11 moral ethical codes that the international art trade and museums worldwide are expected to adhere to and use as tools with which to do 1933-45 provenance research and, where necessary, restitution work. And I'll tell you a little bit later about what restitution means in the art market. I always pick out certain ones to give you a flavor of the power of these principles. The first is art that had been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted should be identified. Well, that's pretty plain speaking what needs still to be done from the perspective of '98. Number 3 is resources and personnel should be made available to facilitate the identification of all art that had been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted. Well, that tells you in very bold, clear terms why the art world needed and still needs people like me and my team to work in it, and why museums need provenance researchers. Number 8, and this is key, if the pre-war owners of art that is found to have been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted, or their heirs can be identified, steps should be taken expeditiously to achieve a just and fair solution. And I'll talk a little bit later about what just and fair means in terms of the art market in which I work. But these presented a complete seismic sea change for museums around the world and for the art trade. Before they were published, before the conference at the end of '98, these were published at the beginning of '99, any auction house could essentially sell with complete impunity unrecovered Nazi loot. Any gallerist could own or offer for sale any piece of unrecovered Nazi loot, and there was very little any heir or claimant could do. Any museum could hold in its permanent collection, or indeed on loan, any piece of unrecovered Nazi loot, and there was basically very little that descendants of the families or individuals who lost these things could do to get them back. That language, those 11 points, 11 principles, which aren't, as I said, laws. There was no hope of getting an international law passed. These are moral ethical codes, but they are what we have as tools to remedy the long unremedied injustice of looting between 33 and 45. And this is what my team worked with and worked to. Although essentially we're practical people who do provenance research between 1933 and 45, when we're offered something for sale that was made before 45, we believe very strongly that we should also educate through the work that we do. And as you'll be able to work out very cleverly, mathematically, 2023 was 25 years after the 1998 Washington Conference. And we organized a series of events around the world, panel discussions, talks, symposia at Christie's, Paris, London, New York, and beyond, to try and tell the world, people like you, more about what we do, because me personally, I regard it as a duty and as a way of looking at the Holocaust and the fate of Europe's Jews through the very practical, quite pragmatic work that an auction house such as Christie's does in terms of restitution. And the first stage of our year-long series of events in 2023 to reflect on what had been achieved in the international art trade and museums in terms of restitution was at Christie's Paris, and we commissioned this French contemporary artist Raphael Denis to make an installation in our Avenue Matignon premises, which basically filled the ground floor of the premises with these blacked out frames to represent all the works that are still missing. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of works that are still missing from Jewish descendants of Jewish families' knowledge, let alone current possession. They're still looking for tens and tens and tens of thousands of works, and there's me introducing the panel at Christie's Paris with second from right, a man called David Zivy, who's head of the French government's provenance research team. So it was a very high caliber of speaker. And as I said, we feel it's our duty to try and educate through the quiet work that we do. This was a panel discussion in October 2023 in New York, where we had a wonderful experience. You can see to my left, in the grey suit, is none other than Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt himself, who convened the Washington Conference in 1998 and drafted those 11 Washington Principles. We convinced him to come and speak about what had been achieved since his conference in 1998 and what still needed to be achieved. So it was an extraordinary opportunity, the 25th anniversary 2 years ago, to be able to tell the world about what had been done and what still needs to be done in terms of my field. Some of you will know of the wonderful Bloch-Bauer Klimts that were restituted from the Belvedere, the National Gallery of Austria in Vienna, to Maria Altmann and her co-heir. And it was memorialized or celebrated in a film called Woman in Gold. And that man next to me there is the wonderful Randy Schoenberg, a Jewish lawyer from Los Angeles, who was the man that led the Bloch-Bauer case and basically sued Austria to try on his client's behalf to get back those 5 magnificent Klimts. I think he was played in the film Woman in Gold by Ryan Reynolds, maybe. Anyway, that was him, and we had a wonderful experience of him giving a talk for us about his work to get back the Bloch-Bauer Klimts 20 years ago at Christie's Vienna in May 2023. And on your right is one of the wonderful Klimts that Maria Altmann and her co-heir got back from the Belvedere in 2006. And it's particularly pertinent a story to Christie's because when they got these 5 Klimts back, Christie's was asked to sell them, 4 at auction in New York in November 2006 and 1 privately. People often confront restitution specialists and provenance researchers, and they often say, when a family gets something back, why do they always sell it? Well, they nearly always have to sell it because it's very hard to timeshare a painting. Often by now, we're talking about 2 or 3 generations down from the family members who lost these things, there are 10 or 15 or 20 heirs who hardly know each other. So usually the only solution is to offer an object that's restituted for sale. Sometimes works that families keep them if there are only 2 or 3 family members, but usually by this generation there are many more. And I've always found it profoundly moving and almost puzzling that often cousins or second cousins have never met and don't need to know each other, and through the process of contacting them to try and orchestrate a settlement, you realize these people hardly know each other. One lives in Vancouver, or one lives in Toulouse, or one lives in Berlin, or whatever. So you're sort of helping to introduce all these people that are related but not familiar. So if anyone asks, or anyone's sitting there thinking, why do they always sell these things? Well, in the case of the Klimts, they couldn't keep owning, probably couldn't even afford the assurance of something worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Usually it's because there are so many family members they need to sell to divide up the proceeds. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I know time is running very fast. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nub of what we do as a restitution team. And rather extraordinarily, I lead a team of 10 colleagues. Almost all of them are 1933-45 provenance researchers. And it's a very practical job, and we don't work in isolation. We work very closely with our expert colleagues in the Impressionist and Modern Art department, the Old Master Paintings department, the European Paintings department that sells 19th century things, experts who sell Renaissance sculptures, experts who catalogue and sell carpets and tapestries and furniture. We work very closely with all the expert departments you can think of at Christie's that you might have encountered. There are some departments whose objects we don't do provenance research on, and one of the ones that springs to mind most powerfully is wine. We don't do any work on trying to work out whether this 1920s bottle of wine might have once belonged to a Jewish collector. That's really beyond possible, broadly speaking. But pretty much everything else you can think of that was made before 45, we do quiet research before it's put into a catalogue or offered for sale. And it's an incredible amount of work. I can't give you an exact number of how many objects there are offered by Christie's around the world that were made before 45 each year. You're probably talking between about 12 and 15,000 objects or more. And the job, essentially, of my team is to try to ensure that not a single unrecovered piece of Nazi loot, as we might term it, is offered unwittingly by Christie's, without having first realized that there's an issue with this object and, in the spirit of the Washington Principles, tried to remedy. So it's going through all these thousands upon thousands of upcoming auction lots with a fine-toothed comb. And we do it from the raw state cataloguing. So we go into the experts' cataloguing system, watching as they're building a sale, putting in the ownership history they know for each object, the literature references, exhibition history, obviously the identity of the artist and the object. We comb through their cataloguing, and there are very abstruse, obscure databases that none of you will have ever encountered, I imagine, online, that you could happily go and look at, that are the databases of unrecovered Nazi loot. Some of the biggest ones are lostart.de, which is the German governmental database that contains records of hundreds of thousands of still missing objects. The records are sometimes great, sometimes terrible, so sometimes there's not even an image. It's Monet landscape with no image, no measurements, which then presents you with an impossible task. How are you going to know whether this Monet that we want to sell, this is the landscape that's still missing from the Zilberberg collection? Sometimes the records are fabulous. The other very big one is the so-called Répertoire des biens spoliés en France, which is the 1947 multi-volume dictionary. It's probably about that fat, published by the French state. Surviving members of Jewish families in France came to the French state after the war and said, my grandmother lost this, my cousin lost that. And they put together basically a dictionary of the thousands upon thousands of objects that were looted by the Germans in occupied France, mostly from Jews, but not exclusively. The problem with that resource, which runs to thousands, as I said, of objects, is probably 1 in 20 is illustrated. So you can already see some of the challenges that we face with visual people. We're presented with art objects for sale, and we have to try and rule in or rule out a possible match. And there are many more databases, one on Hungarian losses, one on losses in fascist Italy. There are other research databases to support our work, such as at the Getty. And this is what young people brandishing their iPhones always found astonishing. These databases all aren't streamed together. So my researchers, when they're looking at a catalogue of Impressionist and modern art in its raw state, looking at the raw cataloguing, the image database, alongside that cataloguing, they have to look at each of the separate databases of unrecovered Nazi loot separately. You don't have one window where you can type in Monet and all these different databases flow together. It doesn't exist. So it's hugely arduous work. And as I said, our job is to try to ensure that not a single piece of unrecovered Nazi loot enters Christie's auctions, which is a really no mean feat. Sometimes my colleagues discover obvious problems and obvious matches. And one of the ones they worked on now, almost 5 years ago, is this marvelous Van Gogh watercolor in front of you called Mel de Blé, which was going to be offered at Christie's New York in 2021. And my dear colleagues, before my time there, I joined in 2022, realized from the ownership history in this case, as well as from databases, that the work had a major problem. The first major problem was that it had belonged to a Jewish collector from Berlin called Max Majorowski, who had left Germany and had fled to the New World via Paris. And he had left that watercolor in the care of, we think, a German Jewish dealer who himself had fled Germany for Paris and had set up his business there. So Max Majorowski, this Berlin-based Jew, had fled Nazi Germany, managed to take that work with him to Paris, left it with a dealer called Paul Graupe, who had then sold it. And it's not clear about whether he'd been given the right to sell it or not. And it had been bought from Paul Graupe by one of the celebrated French Rothschild, in that case Alexandrine de Rothschild, who then herself fled for her life to Switzerland, and almost her entire art collection was looted by the Nazi Einsatzstab, the looting agency, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, in or after 1940, when Germany invaded France. So the work had both been basically lost in flight by a Berlin Jew, Max Meyerowski, had then been purchased in Paris by a French Jew, Alexandrine de Rothschild, and then she had it looted from her when she was in Switzerland. So there were two issues to remedy. Luckily, back in 2021, Christie's consignor was very attuned to and willing to help in resolving, in the spirit of the Washington Principles, those issues, and entered into two separate settlement agreements, one with the sole heir of Max Meyerowski, and one with the multiple heirs of Alexandrine de Rothschild. And I said I'd come back to the notion of Clause 8 of the Washington Principles, which talks about a just and fair solution. In the art market, it actually happens rarely, even though my department is called Restitution, that a consignor, a private owner of an object who comes to a place like Christie's to sell it, either does or is expected to physically restitute that object to a set of heirs if it's discovered that it's an unrecovered piece of Nazi loot. The just and fair provision of Clause 8 of the Washington Principles, in the practical application of those words in the art market, usually means the work still proceeds into an auction sale and the proceeds are split between the consignor side, the current owner, and the set of claimants, or in this case, the two sets of claimants. So they come to a mutual agreement which is enshrined in a legal document, often drafted by our legal teams themselves. The object then proceeds into a sale, and it's the division of the proceeds, not the physical handing back of the work of art to a set of heirs. So it's a practical solution. It's actually quite rare in the international art trade that the expectation is, in the spirit of the Washington Principles, for the current owner to physically hand over the object to a set of claimants. It does happen sometimes, very occasionally, if the current owner is so horrified to realize that he or she owns a piece of unrecovered Nazi loot. They sometimes say, I don't want this to proceed into an auction, I want to give it back to the family members whose grandfather or grandmother or great aunt lost it. But that happens reasonably rarely. It's usually a financial settlement between the parties. As you gathered, I think, I worked for a long time at Sotheby's, for about 21 years, latterly for the last 15 as a restitution person, provenance researcher. And I had a gap year, as it were, what they call it, a year of garden leave, before rejoining the art market and moving to Christie's in March 2022. Something extraordinary happened in my absence, which was, after years of battling, the heirs of a Jewish collector from Germany called Kurt Gravi got back that marvelous Franz Marc painting. By the way, probably my favorite artist, as my Courtauld study was on German Expressionism. He, for me, is it. Anyway, so they, after probably 15 years or 20 years of battling, repeated no's from the German government from Düsseldorf that looks after its museum, the Kunstpalast Düsseldorf. After years of no's, suddenly, late 2021, there was a yes. And the city of Düsseldorf, on the advice of the German restitution panel, agreed to restitute to the heirs of Kurt and Elsa Gravi that marvelous Franz Marc. And why it was such an extraordinary event is because the Franz Marc wasn't sold in the Nazi era in Berlin or Vienna or Paris or Brussels. It was sold by Kurt Gravi in New York in 1940. And that really, for us, shifted and changed everything, because suddenly a recommendation to restitute was made on a work not actually sold in Nazi Europe. It was sold by a Jew, by a Jewish pair. It was sold during the war, but it was sold thousands of miles away from Nazi Europe. It was sold in New York in 1940. But the German restitution panel or commission and the German government and the city of Düsseldorf that is the sort of umbrella for the Kunstpalast Düsseldorf recognized finally that the reason that Kurt and Elsa Gravi sold that marvelous masterpiece was because they were fleeing for their lives from Germany to a new life in the US and had to find a way to survive, and all they had to survive on was the proceeds of that sale. And that changed, it may seem quite obvious to you, but that changed the whole analysis for us, because suddenly we had to look even more closely at the causality of sales between 1933 and 45. So that sale of work in New York in 1940 through a dealer called Nierendorf to a Hollywood mogul, having now been deemed by the German government and restitution panel as problematic and needing restitution of the object to the graviers, changes everything. So since 2021, and we, by the way, were offered that painting for sale in March 2022, just before I joined Christie's. I say we now, I wasn't quite there then, and I managed to go into Christie's just 2 weeks before I took up my role, hurrying into the pre-sale view, hoping to catch a glimpse of that wonderful Franz Marc, only to manage to get into the main gallery before it closed for the putting together of the actual auction evening. And all there was a spotlight on the place where it had been. So I never got to see it. But anyway, the restitution of that painting changed everything. Very similarly, this wonderful winter-lit Monet wasn't sold in a Nazified country. It was sold by a Berlin-based Jewish collector called Richard Semmel as he fled Berlin with his wife, Clara, for a new life in the New World. And he sold all his art collection at 2 auctions in June and November 1933 in Holland, in Amsterdam. Remember that, 1933, June and November. Impressionist and Modern Art, I think, in June, and then Old Master Collection in November. So 7 years before Holland was occupied by the Germans. But again, the Dutch state that has found itself holding some Richard Semmel property in its art collections across the country. The art market, other countries have sought to remedy works with Richard Semmel provenance, recognizing that he was fleeing for his life from Nazi Berlin. He was both an ardent communist, an ardent communist pamphleteer, and a Jew. So the sales in June and November 1933 in Amsterdam, even though it was 7 years before the occupation of Holland, the Netherlands, are widely seen as problematic. And that work, again, was offered for sale between its current owner and the 2 heirs of Richard Semmel in full and final settlement of their claim, and their claim originated from their relatives' selling of the painting in 1933, not in a Nazified country, but recognizing the causality of his sale of his art collection. And that work was offered, I think, in May 2022 in New York. To take it, before we conclude, to an even greater extreme, this wonderful little portrait by Manny of a dog called Bob, which was my team's firm favorite, and to such an extent that 1 or 2 of them even had tapestry reproductions of the painting made for their offices. It's a little portrait like this, Manny's dog called Bob. But the story surrounding its ownership is quite extraordinary. It was owned by a Jewish collector called Estella Katzenellenbogen in Berlin, and I always love her surname because it means cat's elbow. Katzenellenbogen, cat's elbow. She had a husband called Ludwig, divorced him, fled Nazi Germany for California, for Santa Monica. She fled with that painting and other paintings. So you would imagine if she managed to take that work to California with her in the late 30s, but surely if it came up on the art market now, it shouldn't be a problem. Well, in the light of the sale of the Franz Marc in 1940 in New York, that painting, and I remind you of the recalibration of our thinking that then went on after 2021, when the recommendation from the Germans was that the Franz Marc needed to be restituted by the city of Düsseldorf. We look at everything in a very fresh light. And we were worried about the reason that Estella Katzenellenbogen sold this lovely little portrait of a dog by Manet, because we could only show through our quiet, careful research that she had owned it until about March 1945. And the war, of course, was still raging in Europe, and we began to think that the heirs of Estella Katzenellenbogen, of which there are a number, mostly in the US, might regard that sale by her in the US of this painting that she'd fled for her life with from Nazi Germany as problematic. And we got the agreement of the current owners, who are the Getty family, to contact the lawyer representing the Estella Katzenellenbogen heirs, just to ask for their opinion of the current status of this painting. And of course, the lawyer in New York said, you haven't shown to us that Estella Katzenellenbogen managed to keep the painting until after the end of the Second World War in May 1945, and we regard the sale as problematic because she fled with it for her life from Berlin and sold off her surviving art collection that she was able to take with her piece by piece to survive on. So we think it was caused by duress and her being an extremist. And the Getty family understood that analysis and agreed, and in the end the painting was sold with a settlement in place between the Getty family, who were selling for charity, and the heirs of Estella Katzenellenbogen, and as part of the sale proceeds went to settle the Katzenellenbogen's 80-year-old claim. I'm just going to stop on this slide. I know we're running out of time. I had the great privilege to work for 2 years on this marvelous Cézanne landscape. It was consigned to Christie's via, I think, our Zurich office, and the old lady who owned it knew very well that there was an issue attached to it, and she really did the right thing. She approached Christie saying, I want to sort this issue out before I die. And the issue was that it had been owned by a German Jewish collector called Margarete Oppenheim, who died in the mid-30s, and her estate was put to auction in Berlin. And rather than the beneficiaries of her estate receiving the proceeds, they were all snaffled by the Nazi regime. So that summer 1936 auction sale of the Margarete Oppenheim's estate is widely viewed as problematic. And this little old lady who owned that magnificent landscape realized that, came to Christie's asking us to try and remedy this long dormant historical taint. We put her in touch with a Berlin-based lawyer. He made direct contact on our urging, with the 2 sets of lawyers who look after the Margarete Oppenheim estate, which still exists. And over 2 years, they worked out an agreement. And on the 29th of October, 2025, the work was offered for sale at Christie's King Street, where I work. And the Oppenheim side shared in the proceeds of the sale. It sold for just over £5 million. So that was 2 years of work. That one painting, which I was central to the research on and the urging of the dialogue between the Oppenheim heirs' lawyers and the little old lady's lawyers, took a good 2.5 years of work. And that's one work out of the thousands and thousands and thousands that we work on. I think I have to stop there. I could go on all day, but I think we have to have some time for a few questions, maybe. Do you want to go first in the front row?
Thank you very much. That was an amazing talk.
Pleasure.
Insightful, the stories, the background, the history.
There we are.
Okay, so insightful, magical stories, all the background, you actually present it so well. You could hear a pin drop. You could absolutely hear a pin drop. So, Richard, thank you so much, so much. Right, any questions, please? Okay.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. What sort of percentage would your organization take for this kind of work?
We don't take any percentage.
When you have sold this piece of work, you say the settlement is between various people.
Yeah.
So
we don't charge the vendors any. Usually, when we orchestrate a settlement relating to Jewish Nazi-era losses, we don't charge the vendor anything to sell the item through us. When we're talking about percentages that the current owner gives to the claimant side, we don't cream off any percentage. It simply is something that they have to do to lift the historical taint. Because we, as an auction house, like any auction house, can't convey good title to the object if we knowingly offer it for sale with an unresolved Nazi-era taint attached. So we're not in that case, making money out of the settlement. It's something that has to be in place for the item to be allowed to proceed into an auction.
My second question is, you have these databases
Yes.
where your team has to work.
Yeah.
Do you think that in this modern age you can use technology like AI to merge those databases?
It's a good question. It's something, of course, that the world is looking at. But lots of young people, after I give talks, come up to me brandishing their iPhones, and they say they could design some app within a few hours that would stream everything together. The problem is this information is owned by different organizations. Lost Art is data owned by the German government. The Repertoire des Biens Spoliés is owned, I guess, by the French state. The Art Loss Register is a for-profit business here in London that holds information on works we're not even aware of. And the auction houses and dealers pay for them to do a secondary checking of everything we check. No one has access to their database. And you pay, it's a paid-for service. So the problem is, essentially, there's different stakeholders and different ownerships of all this different data. So how one resolves that to get some whiz kid in San Francisco to bring it all together, and my team can simply type in Pizarro or Monet, and every single iteration of a looted work of art around the world is in that one scroll down sort of result, is anyone's guess. It doesn't work currently because of the proprietary nature of the data, not because the technology doesn't exist to bring it all together. Maybe the man who had his hand up early on there.
What is the relationship between the auction houses and the Commission for Looted Art in Europe?
Well, I mean, Anne Webber's a dear friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine. I've known as a writer. My first novel, Five Amber Beads, came out in 2006. The first person to interview me in front of an audience about it was her. So we work closely with her, and we use the data that she has on the Commission's website closely. We follow her news digest closely. I speak to her every few weeks. So there's a very good relationship between me personally. I can't speak for the art market overall. I mean, I'm one of many thousands. We work closely with her. I'm on a what's it called? An advisory group with her for the British government. So there's a good relationship, broadly speaking.
I'd actually like to put a more positive end to some of these questions, and that is the wonderful end to that Klimt painting. You know where it is, don't you? And so do I.
One's in the Neue Gallery in New York.
Yes,
yeah,
and you know how that happened, because
Yeah.
the family put it up. But I think people should know that, because it's so positive. It was put up for auction and bought by a very, very wealthy individual called the Estée Lauder family.
Yeah.
And basically, he gave it to the Now, or the New, or whatever you want to call it, in New York, and there it is for everybody to
Yes.
see. And it's just a wonderful end.
It is. That's a very good point. Well worth stating. There are lots of hands. Maybe you at the front, because you've had your hand up for a while, and then we can go back down the room.
I recently read a book called The Orpheus Clock.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know of it. And if my memory serves me right, the Washington Principles came about somewhere in the middle of all his detective work for his own family.
I know him very well.
Yes. Now, obviously, there are many countries. His family's collection ended up scattered all over the world, like probably many did. But obviously, some countries were notoriously, some countries and institutions were notoriously difficult and didn't entertain.
Still are.
Right, that's what I was going to ask. Are there some countries or institutions that do not adhere or respect the Washington Principles?
I mean, 44 countries, I always think, although some people say it's 42, sent emissaries of one sort or another to the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets. The amount of countries that actively do provenance research on their national or regional collections, have proper databases, have restitution panels. I mean, there are only 6 in the world of those. So, Russia doesn't restitute, Poland doesn't restitute, Hungary doesn't restitute. They have inward restitution, but they don't give out. They all sent people to the Washington Conference. So I would say the vast majority of countries are bad. Some are better. The Swiss are about to, just now, launch their commission, their panel. UK has one, of course, the Spoliation Advisory Panel. Germany has what was called the Limbach Commission. France has the CIVS. So they're all in Europe, but most countries do nowhere near enough. So I'm not going to give you a sort of hierarchy of... The only country that has a law is Austria. They have a restitution law. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, Simon Goodman is one of the reasons for the Washington Conference, of course, because he was about the only person I can think of who had success really before it. And going back to Anne Webber and the Commission for Looted Art, she made a film for the BBC about Simon's case.
What was his name, Simon?
Goodman. He's based in Los Angeles, a British A&R man from the music industry who then gave up his job and has spent the last 30-odd years looking for the Fritz Gutmann collection. Yes, so he was one of the few to have success before the Washington Conference. There are many hands.
The lady here and then the gentleman here.
I wanted to ask you about the Heidi Horton collection. First of all, that you sold the first half,
Yes.
and then I think the second auction was cancelled.
Yes.
And I wondered what happened to that. And also I wanted to ask you, were any works returned to the original owners?
Well, I don't know what happened to the rest
Works, I mean, jewellery.
Yeah. I don't know what happened to the rest of their collection. I've no idea because I wasn't involved at all. Nothing from the Geneva 2023 auction was restituted because it was all modern jewellery. It was all made from the 1970s onwards. That wasn't the problem with it. The problem was the auction house hadn't thought enough about the source of wealth, where her late husband had made his fortune. We weren't involved at all, which is one of the major mistakes. They didn't consult the restitution team. So the objects themselves weren't a problem. They were Bulgari, or however you pronounce it, and Chanel and whatever, Cartier. They were all post-70s, clunking jewellery, and that wasn't the issue. It was where she got the money to buy these things was the issue. So there was no restitution that went on. I don't know about the foundation's ownership and what they have still. I think Christie's made the message very clear that they should do provenance research. How much they've acted on that, I'm not sure, because we've detached completely as far as I'm aware. It was a very sorry... Just imagine, right at the time when we were organising that series of events around the world to promote the good work that we do in restitution, Christie's was in Geneva selling the Heidi Horton collection of jewellery.
So no money was ever returned to people?
As far as I'm aware, a good portion of Christie's earnings, whatever they were given to charities to try and support Holocaust education and research, particularly in the US. I think at Yale, and maybe other centres as well. So, but not the money that the foundation got. No, I'm sure, I don't imagine they've done anything with it like that. I'm not party to any of that, though. Christie's money, yes, but I don't know about the foundation.
I just wanted to check. It seems from the way you've been talking that the key starting point in restitution is knowing specifically what was owned.
Broadly speaking, yes.
Are there any cases where collections that are known to have existed, but the contents of which are unknown or undocumented, have been restituted?
That's a very good point. Yes, I mean, there are many families, both, well, in my experience, there are some families that simply had no idea that their great-grandfather or great-uncle had an art collection, and therefore, by dint of that lack of knowledge, they wouldn't know what was in them. Even when families know that their grandfather or great-uncle or whatever had an art collection, they struggle to piece together what it was. They have to try and locate insurance documents, pre-war inventories. It's hugely difficult. I always think of a man called Tim Schwartz, whose father had, I think, in his office in Vienna a work of art, and all Tim had as evidence was a drawing that his dad had made of it. It's very, very difficult. But I suppose one can't, if I'm going to be defensive, one can't blame me and the auction house for not knowing what a family had if they themselves don't know. But yes, of course, having a knowledge, some sort of degree of knowledge is vital.
Are there any people who specialise in the detective work necessary to find out what might have been in that collection, what was in that collection?
Broadly speaking, yes, such as the Commission for Looted Art in London and the Holocaust Claims Processing Office in New York. They will try and do extensive research to rebuild the detail of collections. But that also comes, of course, from the art historians. I am an art historian, but we don't act as art historians, but people who are writing books, scholarly monographs on artists' works, will of course, particularly these days, try and build in their information provenance information, and that might lead a family member to discover, wow, that Gainsborough was owned by great-uncle so-and-so. So art historians are key as well, when they write monographs or catalogue resumes on the artists they're specialised in, trying to build in as much information as they can, because then families can alight on that information in scholarly texts. So it takes that sort of work as well. One final question, maybe? The lady in green has had her hand up for a while.
Thank you. It occurs to me that there must be a lot of hidden art that has been lost because of the nature of private collectors who do not wish to know where this masterpiece came from or to share it with anybody else.
I would say it's by no means only private collectors. Think of all the, I don't know how many thousands of museums there are around the world. I think in Germany alone there are 3,000. How many of those publish their collections online? So, broadly speaking, it's a good point, but it's not just private ownership.
The other point I wanted to ask you about was, we know very well that a lot of Nazis fled to South America and far-flung places, and I don't know whether you get anything from that part of the world or if it just stays there.
Well, some of you may recall that recent news story from the second half of last year, where there was a property listing put online, and some eagle-eyed art detective spotted on the wall in one of the images of the interior a looted work of art from the Goudstikke gallery stock in Amsterdam. He was a Jew, fled Amsterdam with his wife to the UK, died on board ship, fell down an open manhole. He left behind a black book containing all the detail of his inventory in his Amsterdam gallery. One of the works ended up in Argentina in that lady's house, whose house was on view online for sale. And they said that's one of the missing works. So things do turn up in South America, of course. Not as many as one may imagine, but they do, yeah.
We're right on time. Richard, you've travelled all the way from Oxford today. We're so appreciative of your time, your expertise in making everything come to life. Just for everybody to know, Richard's not dashing away. We're here for a few more minutes. He's also got some of his books here, if you'd like to buy as well. Also, one notice from me, which for our new members or anybody else as well as, on the 12th of February, we have our new members' tea, where you're most welcome to join us and find out more about U3A and what we can give to you. Together with, we also had a request for an art appreciation course group. So if anybody knows anybody that would like to lead an art appreciation course, then please get into contact with me. Richard, can we have another round of applause for Richard, please?